Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. Two great guests. We have Peter Schweitzer and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But before we get to them, I want to underscore where the Democratic Socialists of America stand, and I want to underscore why they are so dangerous. But I want to give it a historical context. So let's get started. What do they stand for? Abolish the Electoral College. That, of course, would empower heavily the dark blue states and the metropolitan areas. In other words, it would weight the electoral process toward the Democrats, and two-thirds of the country would be cut out of the process. They want to give D.C. statehood, a city, and Puerto Rico a territory statehood. Why those in particular? Because that would ensure they get 4 more Democrat senators, making it virtually impossible for the Republicans ever to have a majority in the Senate. Open borders, defund ICE, pack the Supreme Court, pack it. So you have an ideological Democrat Supreme Court. That is a POLITBURO, a POLITBURO. So you and I and others, Mr. and Mrs. America, you'd have no shot at reversing anything that they do because the court would be theirs too. Medicare for all, which of course would kill Medicare, and all private insurance. All private insurance. Seems pretty radical, doesn't it? A wealth tax. You see this popping up in states, but it's also something that's come up at the federal level. So-called climate change and radical regulation over all aspects of our lives and the economy. The entire private sector. Free college education. Eliminate student loan debt. Gut the First Amendment to limit free speech during political campaigns. Gut the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and so forth and so on. That's quite a radical agenda, don't you think, America? Well, guess what? I just gave you the list of positions that have been taken by the Democrat Party. Even before this Democratic Socialists of America, before those people, those flunkies, even made themselves known in any significant way. This is the agenda of the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party. You see, the Democrat Party is a radical party. In many ways, it's an alien party that does not embrace constitutionalism. It does not embrace the Declaration. It does not embrace Americanism generally. The Democrat Party gave birth to the Democratic Socialists of America, and there is significant overlap. Significant overlap. Let me explain what I mean. This entire self-identified progressive movement, which I've called American Marxism, started in the 1890s. Is and was, as I wrote in Rediscovering Americanism, built on the ideas espoused by Karl Marx, who died in 1883. It adapted many of his ideas to our American system, as I wrote in American Marxism, thereby differentiating it from the more comprehensive and aggressive form of communism we see today. The Democrat Party became the vessel for this movement and its ideology. It is the progeny of Marxism, but again, tailored for America. And one of its earliest intellectuals was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a professor, a scholar, a president of Princeton. He wrote several key books and essays on the subject, all of which I've read. He was not alone. There was Herbert Crowley and John Dewey and Walter Weil and others. And by the way, ready for this one? There was a prominent Republican who had become influenced by Crowley in particular. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. You may recall, Roosevelt ran for president in 1912 in a new third party he created. It was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, but the official name of the party was the Progressive Party. And he created that third party after failing to secure the Republican nomination against Howard Taft, which led to the election of Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt was more of an anomaly among Republicans. The roots of Marxist ideology, again, tailored for the American political and governmental environment, are in fact the roots of the modern-day Democrat Party. The battle between the Democratic Socialists of America and the rest of the Democrat Party is not as is being presented to you on television and other formats. It is really a difference between a more purist form of Marxism without the veneer of Americanism. Marxism without the veneer of Americanism. Establishment understandings through decades of experience, language and marketing, the Democrat Party understands must be shaped to attract voters and donors. Let me put it this way. The DSA is more Trotskyite. The Democrat Party is more Gorbachev. But back to Woodrow Wilson, because he's important in understanding what we're dealing with today. Woodrow Wilson had nothing but contempt for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, respecting the Constitution, he argued that it was written and adopted by individuals who were attempting to enshrine for all time their beliefs, their values, their governing system, their economic system, and imposing it on this nation, America, for the rest of time. He said that the Constitution may have been fine for that time when they wrote it, adopted it, and ratified it. It was written for then, but not today, not for the future, not for modernity. Wilson said just as the framers were free to create a governing system for our country back then that accommodated the events back then, he said we're free to do the same today. They can't handcuff us with this Constitution. So Wilson condemned the entire construct of the Constitution. He attacked the idea of federalism, where the states were free to do as they wish, in contravention, he said, of the best interests of the nation as a whole, undermining the common good. Wilson focused his most virulent criticism on separation of powers, which is the heart and soul of our Constitution, which is what makes America what it is today. He argued that, quote, the trouble with the theory of limited and divided government is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. He argued that government is like a body of organs. If each organ is working against the other, rather than in harmony, it cannot survive. This is where the phrase living and breathing document comes from. Living and breathing document. It comes from that. And this is why the radical left and left-wing activists and activist judges and so forth use it as a slogan. It's a living and breathing document. It's living and breathing. So it can be applied to modern times. No. So it can be applied to their economic ideology, their governing ideology, DEI, and whatever else they come up with. Wilson denounced individualism, which, of course, is central to the Declaration and the Constitution. We are the sovereigns. You are the sovereign over yourself. De Tocqueville argued there's a circle of liberty around each human being that must not and cannot be molested by other human beings, by organized governments. Wilson rejects that. The left rejects that. The Bill of Rights is all about protecting you as an individual against this national federal government. So they reject the Constitution. Now, they wave it around all the time when they think it will benefit them. But when it comes to the macro, to their big vision, to their counter-revolution, to the American Revolution, the Constitution stands in the way. In 1887, only 4 years after the death of Marx, 4 years, Wilson wrote an essay titled Socialism and Democracy. And here's what he said in part. It is very clear that in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one of the same. They both rest upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be, limits of principle there are upon strict analysis, none. In other words, he's saying there's no limit to the powers of the collective, of government. He later says, in the same essay, the germinal conceptions of democracy are as free from all thought of a limitation of public authority as are the corresponding conceptions of socialism. There are no limits to public authority any more than there are limits to socialism. Now, again, why is this important? Because Wilson is one of the main founding fathers of the modern-day Democrat Party. He's one of the main founding fathers of what I call American Marxism, the application of Marxism to Americanism. This is very important, very important. Now, you've heard some of the Democrats say more recently, all the DSA is saying, all they're saying is, they have their views and we need to bring them into a big tent, and they say, and look, it's okay. Look, I'm an FDR Democrat. I'm an FDR Democrat. That's a good thing. Well, let's talk about Franklin Roosevelt in the minutes I have left. Franklin Roosevelt's 1937 Constitution Day address. This was delivered not long after he lost the battle to pack the Supreme Court, which is what the Democrats will successfully do if they get the presidency, the House, and the Senate. Back then, the House Democrats in particular stopped the Democrat president. Today's a whole other story. So what did he say in this speech in 1937 after he lost the battle over packing the court? He said, quote, when they considered
the fundamental powers of the new national government, they used generality, implication, and the statement of mere objectives as intentional phrases which flexible statesmanship of the future within the Constitution could adapt to time and circumstance. For instance, the framers used broad and general language capable of meeting evolution and change when they referred to commerce between the states, the taxing power, and the general welfare.
No, they didn't. That's not what the document says, and it's not what the Madison notes demonstrate, they said, during the debates over the Constitution. He's saying, these words, they were very flexible, very general. There was ambiguity, and so the framers intended it that way. So they can't decide whether to trash the framers, trash the Constitution, or rewrite the Constitution and lie about the framers. FDR later said in that speech, for 150 years,
we have had an unending struggle between those who would preserve this original broad concept of the Constitution as a layman's instrument of government and those who would shrivel the Constitution into a lawyer's contract. You will find no justification in any of the language of the Constitution for delay in the reforms which the mass of the American people now demand.
See, this is typical of the left. When they're not trashing the Constitution outright, they're lying about the Constitution. They're really saying the Constitution's limitation on the power of the socialists or the Marxists, the power-hungry generally are a barrier to what they want to do and how they want to govern. The principles on which the Constitution was drafted are those in the Declaration. From the Enlightenment, the Judeo-Christian value system, they are not principles that age over time, even though they are not newly invented. In fact, the so-called newly invented principles aren't new either. Feudalism, centralism, fascism, communism. The purpose of these principles is to provide borders to protect you, the individual, and the civil society, and our freedom, and our unalienable rights from masterminds and the mob. We as individuals have maximum freedom in a just and consensual society, but government does not have maximum freedom to do as it wishes. One of my favorite quotes is from C.S. Lewis, who wrote the following. Listen to this. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. You hear that? Bernie Sanders, AOC, you hear it day in and day out. Mondami and so forth. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell on earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insults. To be cured, quote unquote, against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who've not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will. To be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. You're just too stupid to know how to live. But these virtuous types, they know how you should live. That's his point. Point is that even virtue requires boundaries to prevent it from turning into fanaticism or tyranny. And when you hear the communists, the Democratic Socialists of America, and these Democrats, what do they sound like? It's also why the Democrats and the Democratic Socialists of America self-righteously wrap themselves in virtue, as they seek to destroy our republic. It is always said to be for the good of the people, especially the working people. The Democrat Party is the problem. The Democratic Socialists of America, don't get me wrong, they're a problem too. But they were birthed by the Democrat Party, and they have a whole lot in common, even though they may speak differently.